In the sleepy village of St. Mary's Hollow, where apple orchards hide dark secrets, Farmer John Harrow is found dead, poisoned by his own cider. Was it his strained wife, Margaret, desperate to escape crushing debts? The sullen farmhand, Tom, nursing a decade of grudges? The feuding neighbor, Henry, whose temper burned as fierce as his rivalry? Or the cunning London buyer, Clara Vane, whose ambition for the farm's soaring value knew no bounds? Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose gentle demeanor and razor-sharp mind unravel a web of lies, from muddy boot prints to scarlet-stained cigarette stubs, to reveal a killer hiding in plain sight. In this village of whispers, one truth will strike like poison. Chapter 1. The Quiet Village. The village of St. Mary's Hollow, nestled in a fold of the English countryside, where the hills dipped gently into meadows, dotted with grazing sheep. Its cottages, their thatched roofs weathered by time, stood in tidy rows along lanes bordered by wild roses and blackberry brambles. The church, with its squat Norman tower, rang out the hours with a bell that had tolled since the days of Cromwell, and the air carried the faint sweetness of ripening apples from the orchards beyond. It was a place where life unfolded slowly, where secrets whispered among neighbors were as much a part of the landscape as the ancient oaks. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window of the vicarage, gazed out at this tranquil scene. She had come to St. Mary's Hollow at the invitation of her old friend, Mrs. Lucy Clement, the vicar's wife, whose letters had brimmed with tales of village life. Miss Marple, with her neat gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, found the village charming, though she knew well that even the sleepiest hamlets harbored their shadows. Her knitting lay in her lap, the needles idle for now, as she listened to the morning's gossip filtering through the open window. The vicarage, a rambling house of faded charm, sat opposite the village shop, where Mrs. Bantry, the postmistress, held court. It was there, amid the clink of teacups and the rustle of newspapers, that Miss Marple first heard the news that would stir St. Mary's Hollow from its slumber. John Harrow's dead, Mrs. Bantry's voice carried, sharp with shock. Found, this morning, stiff as a board, with a jug of his own cider beside him. Poisoned, they're saying. Miss Marple's hands paused over her knitting, though her expression remained serene. John Harrow, she had learned, was the master of Greenbough Farm, a sprawling orchard that produced the finest cider in the county. His apples, plump and ruby red, were the pride of the village, and his temper, fiery as a blacksmith's forge, was its scandal. She had seen him only once, striding through the village with a face like thunder, his broad shoulders filling out a tweed jacket, a man of vigor, not yet old, and now dead. Mrs. Clement bustled into the room, her cheeks flushed. "Jane, have you heard? It's dreadful. Poor John Harrow, gone just like that. The police are at the farm now, and the village is in an uproar." Her voice trembled, but her eyes gleamed with the excitement that sudden tragedy brings to quiet places. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already at work. "Poison, you say? That's a curious thing. Cider is such an innocent drink, isn't it? And yet, not so innocent today." Her tone was mild, but her thoughts were sharp, turning over the possibilities. Poison was no accident, not in a village like this. It spoke of intent, of someone close enough to know Harrow's habits, to slip something deadly into his daily jug. Mrs. Clement sank into a chair, fanning herself with a hymn book. They say it was cyanide. Can you imagine? In his own kitchen? Margaret, his wife, is beside herself, and the farmhand, Tom Rudge, was seen lurking about last night. Then there's Henry Gale, the neighbor. He and John were always at odds over that water ditch. And that London woman, Clara Vane, she's been sniffing around the farm for weeks, wanting to buy it. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, though she said only, "How very curious." She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly as she considered the names. Margaret Harrow, the wife, would be the first to fall under suspicion. as wives so often did. Tom Rudge, the farmhand, might harbor a grudge, for loyalty could curdle into resentment. Henry Gale's feud suggested a motive rooted in pride or envy, emotions Miss Marple knew could drive a man to desperate acts. And Clara Vane, the outsider, brought the sharp scent of ambition to this rustic drama. For suspects, each with a thread to unravel. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I think, Lucy, I might take a walk to the village shop. Fresh air does wonders for clearing the mind. Mrs. Clement, accustomed to her friend's quiet ways, nodded, unaware that Miss Marple's stroll was less about air and more about the whispers she might gather at the shop. The air buzzed with speculation. Mrs. Bantry, her apron dusted with flour, leaned over the counter. It's a scandal, Miss Marple. John Harrow was no saint, mind you, always shouting at poor Tom, and Margaret put up with more than most would, but poison, that's a woman's crime, isn't it? Her eyes darted to a group of women by the tinned goods, their heads bent. Together, Miss Marple smiled faintly. People do surprise one, Mrs. Bantry. Men, women, it's the heart that matters, not the hand. She bought a skein of wool she didn't need, her ears attuned to the chatter. A boy had seen Tom Rudge near the farm's back gate at dusk. Henry Gale had been heard cursing Harrow's name at the Red Lion. Clara Vane's sleek car had been spotted near the orchard 2 days ago. And Margaret Harrow. She was crying in church last Sunday, a voice murmured. Something about money troubles. As Miss Marple stepped back into the sunlight, her mind was a tapestry of half-patterns. John Harrow's death was no random act. Someone had known his habits, his trust in his own cider. Someone had waited, watched, and struck. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, where a poisoned cake had unraveled a web of jealousy. Villages, she reflected, were much the same, everywhere full of secrets. Waiting for a keen eye to see them, she turned toward the vicarage, her step light but purposeful. The police would do their work. But Miss Marple knew that truth often hid in the small things. A glance, a word, a muddy footprint. St. Mary's Hollow had given her its first thread, and she would follow it, as she always did, until the pattern was complete. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The morning mist still clung to the fields of St. Mary's Hollow as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward Greenbough Farm, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. The village, though awake, seemed hushed, as if holding its breath after the shock of John Harrow's death. Mrs. Clement had insisted on accompanying her, but Miss Marple, with a gentle smile, had suggested her friend stay behind to tend to the vicarage's morning duties. I shall only be a nuisance to the police, Lucy, she'd said, though her sharp eyes betrayed a purpose far from idle curiosity. Inspector Craddock, a man whose courtesy matched his competence, had telephoned the vicarage to request Miss Marple's presence, citing her unique perspective on village matters. She suspected he humored her, but she was not one to refuse an open door, especially one leading to a mystery. Greenbough Farm lay at the edge of the village, its orchards stretching across gentle slopes, the trees heavy with apples that gleamed like garnets in the pale sunlight. The farmhouse itself was a sturdy, ivy-clad building, its stone walls weathered by generations of harrows. As Miss Marple approached, she noted the police car parked askew by the gate, its presence an affront to the rural calm. A young constable, his face flushed with the importance of his task, stood guard at the front door, nodding stiffly as she introduced herself. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and something sharper, more unsettling, faint, bitter tang that lingered like a ghost. The kitchen, where John Harrow had met his end, was a large, low-ceilinged room, its flagged floor scrubbed clean but for a few smudges near the door. A heavy oak table dominated the space, and on it sat the jug of cider, its earthenware surface unremarkable save for the faint sheen of fingerprint powder. An overturned chair lay sprawled beside it, its legs pointing accusingly at the ceiling. A half-eaten slice of apple pie rested on a plate, the fork still embedded in its crust, as if Harrow had been interrupted mid. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the details. A curtain slightly askew, a teacup on the counter with a faint lipstick stain, and a single muddy boot print near the back door, its tread sharp and distinct. Inspector Craddock greeted her with a nod, his notebook open in his hand. He was a lean man in his 40s, with a face that suggested patience tested by experience. "Miss Marple, good of you to come," Mrs. Clement said. "You've a knack for seeing what others miss." His tone was polite, but there was a trace of amusement in his eyes, as if he expected little more than quaint village wisdom. Miss Marple smiled demurely, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, and said nothing. She had long ago learned that men like Craddock underestimated her at their peril. The doctors confirmed it. Craddock continued, gesturing toward the jug. "Cyanide, fast-acting and deadly. Mixed into the cider, likely last night. Harrow was found this morning by his wife, Margaret, when she came down to start breakfast. He was already gone, slumped right there." He pointed to the floor beside the table, where a chalk outline marked the spot. No sign of a struggle, no forced entry. Whoever did this knew their way around. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes tracing the room's edges. The kitchen was orderly, almost too much so, as if someone had tidied it after the fact. A photograph on the mantel caught her attention. John Harrow, his face stern but not unkind, stood beside a woman with a tight smile. Margaret, she presumed. The frame was slightly crooked, as if recently disturbed. She filed the detail away, her mind already weaving a thread of suspicion. "Tell me, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but precise, "who had access to this kitchen last night? And this cider, where did it come from?" Craddock flipped a page in his notebook. "The cider was pressed here on the farm, from Harrow's own apples. Margaret says she filled the jug yesterday evening, as she did every night for his supper. She left it on the table before going to bed. Harrow liked to sit up late, reading or working on his accounts. Anyone could have come in after that, though. Back doors rarely locked, village habits being what they are." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze settling on the boot print. It was deep, deliberate, not the casual scuff of a passing visitor. "And the suspects?" she asked, though she already knew the names from Mrs. Clement's gossip. Craddock sighed, as if the weight of the village's secrets pressed on him. "4, so far. Margaret Harrow, the widow. She inherits the farm, and there's talk of money troubles. Tom Rudge, the farmhand, a surly sort who clashed with Harrow over wages. Henry Gale, the neighbor, who's been at war with Harrow over a water ditch for years. And Clara Vane, a cider buyer from London, who's been pressing Harrow to sell the farm. Each of them had reason to want him gone, and none have ironclad alibis." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked faintly as she adjusted her bag, her mind sifting through the names. Margaret, the wife, would be scrutinized first, as spouses always were. Money troubles could drive even the most devoted to desperate acts, she knew, recalling a case in St. Mary Mead where a wife had poisoned her husband over a dwindling bank account. Tom Rudge, the farmhand, might harbor a grudge deep enough to fester into murder. Resentment, she had seen, was a slow poison of its own. Henry Gale's feud suggested a motive born of pride or spite, emotions that could turn deadly in a man's heart. And Clara Vane, the outsider, brought a calculating air to the mix, her motives perhaps tied to profit rather than passion. For threads, each leading somewhere, but where? She stepped toward the jug, peering at it without touching. The bitter scent was faint but unmistakable, a chemical edge that clashed with the homely aroma of apples. "Cyanide," she murmured. "Not an easy thing to come by, Inspector. It's used for pest control, isn't it? Farmers might have it, but it's not something one leaves lying about." Craddock raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her knowledge. "You're right. We're checking the farm for any stores of it. Margaret says they keep some in the orchard shed for dealing with wasps' nests, but it's locked up tight to her, so she claims. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the boot print again. It was fresh, the mud still damp, suggesting it had been left not long before the police arrived. The tread was distinctive, with a deep, crochetted pattern, unlike the smooth shoes of a city dweller. A farmer's boot, perhaps, or a workman's. She made a mental note to compare it to the footwear of the suspects, though she suspected the answer lay not in the print alone but in what it signified. Someone had been here. In this kitchen, after Margaret left the jug, the inspector led her to the back door, which opened onto a cobbled yard, leading to the orchard. The lock was simple, a latch easily lifted from either side. No signs of tampering, Craddock said. Whoever came in didn't need to break anything. They either had a key or knew the door was open. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze sweeping the yard. Beyond it, the orchard stretched, its trees casting long shadows in the morning light. A narrow path led to a small shed, its door slightly ajar. She made no comment but stored the detail away, like a scrap of wool for her knitting. The shed would need to be checked, not just for cyanide, but for other clues of footprint. A dropped cigarette, a thread of cloth caught on a nail. Back in the kitchen, Craddock introduced her to Dr. Haydock, a brisk man with a clipped mustache, whom was packing his medical bag. Cyanide, no question, he said, his voice matter of fact. Death would have been quick minutes, at most. Harrow drank the cider, felt the effects almost at once, and collapsed. No chance to call for help. Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. And the pie, doctor, was it touched? Haydock glanced at the table. The pie's clean, as far as I can tell. We'll test it, of course, but the cyanide was in the cider. The jug's half empty, and Harrow's glass had traces of it. He took a good swallow before it hit him. She nodded, her eyes lingering on the pie. It was homemade, the crust golden, and slightly uneven, the kind of pie a wife might bake for her husband. Yet the fork, embedded in the slice, was oddly placed, as if set down in haste. A small thing, but Miss Marple knew that small things could unravel great mysteries. She thought of a case in her own village, where a misplaced teacup had pointed to a killer's lie. Craddock cleared his throat, drawing her attention. We've taken statements from the household. Margaret says she went to bed around 9, leaving Harrow in the kitchen. Tom Rudge claims he was in the barn, fixing the cider press, until late. Henry Gale says he was at home with his wife, though she's a bit vague on the timing. Clara Vane, the buyer, was at the village inn, or so the innkeeper says. We're checking their stories, but it's a muddle so far. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly, though her expression remained placid. A muddle, yes, but muddles have a way of sorting themselves out, don't they? One only needs to find the right thread to pull. She glanced at the photograph again, noting the tension in Margaret's smile. A wife under strain, perhaps, or a woman with secrets. The ledger on the table caught her eye next a thick, leather-bound book, its pages dog-eared. She made no move to touch it, but she suspected it held more than farm accounts, debts, promises. Threats all could be written in numbers, as easily as in words. As they stepped outside, the constable approached, holding a small evidence bag. Found this in the yard, sir, he said, showing Craddock a cigarette stub, its tip smudged with a faint trace of lipstick. It was near the back gate, half buried in the dirt. Craddock frowned, taking the bag. Could be nothing, but we'll check it. Margaret doesn't smoke, and I doubt Harrow did. Might belong to one of the others, or a visitor. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though she said nothing. Lipstick was a clue as telling as a fingerprint, and she recalled Clara Vane's poised demeanor, her city polish. But village women, too, could wear lipstick, and farmhands could have visitors. She thought of a young woman in St. Mary Mead, whose scarlet lipstick had betrayed a rendezvous and a motive. The inspector walked her back to the gate, his tone warming slightly. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple. If you spot anything we've missed, you'll let me know." "Of course, Inspector," she replied, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I'm only an old woman, but I do notice things." She smiled, and Craddock, for the first time, wondered if he'd underestimated her as she made her way back to the vicarage. The village seemed to close ranks around its secrets. The orchard whispered in the wind, the apples gleaming with a beauty that belied the poison they'd carried. Miss Marple's mind was alive with possibilities, each suspect a piece in a puzzle she was only beginning to assemble. The boot print, the cigarette, the ledger, the small things, but in her experience, small things were the key to great truths. She thought of John Harrow, a man who'd lived loudly and died silently, and she knew that somewhere, in the quiet of St. Mary's Hollow, a killer waited, believing themselves safe. But Miss Marple, with her knitting and her unassuming air, was already on their trail. Chapter 3. The Widow's Tale. The parlor at Greenbough Farm was a room of faded elegance, its heavy curtains drawn against the autumn chill, casting a soft gloom over the polished oak furniture. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to warm the atmosphere, which seemed to hold the weight of recent tragedy. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her feet, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she observed Margaret Harrow, the widow, who stood by the window, her silhouette stark against the gray light. Inspector Craddock, his notebook balanced on his knee, occupied the settee, his presence a quiet reminder of official scrutiny. Miss Marple had been invited to join the interview, ostensibly as a comforting presence for Margaret, but her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her presence was anything but passive. Margaret Harrow was a woman in her late 40s, her face etched with lines that spoke of years spent managing a farm, and a husband whose temper was as renowned as his cider. Her dark hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back in a severe bun, and her morning dress, though neatly pressed, hung slightly loose, as if she had lost weight in the days before her husband's death. Her hands, clasped tightly before her, trembled as she poured tea from a chipped porcelain pot, the clink of the cups the only sound in the tense silence. Miss Marple noted the tremor, wondering if it was grief, fear, or something less easily named. "Mrs. Harrow," Craddock began, his voice measured but firm, "we need to go over the events of last night again. You said you prepared the cider, Jug, for your husband, as you always did. Can you tell us exactly what happened?" Margaret turned from the window, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She sat across from them, her posture rigid, as if bracing for a blow. "It was no different from any other night," she said, her voice low but steady. "John liked his cider after supper. I pressed the apples myself yesterday afternoon, as I've done for years. I filled the jug, added a pinch of sugar. He liked it sweet and left it on the kitchen table. He was in the study, going over the accounts. I went upstairs around 9, to bed. I didn't see him again until—" Her voice faltered, and she looked down at her hands, twisting a handkerchief. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. The handkerchief was new, its laced edge pristine, unlike the worn fabric of Margaret's dress. A small detail, but one that suggested preparation, perhaps for this very moment. She recalled a widow in St. Mary Mead who had clutched a similar handkerchief during an interview, her tears masking a colder truth. "And you heard nothing in the night?" Miss Marple asked gently, her tone that of a concerned neighbor. "No footsteps, no voices." Margaret shook her head. "The house is old, Miss Marple. It creaks and settles, but I'm used to it. I sleep soundly, too soundly, perhaps." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and Miss Marple noted the faint bitterness in her tone. Was it regret for not hearing her husband's final moments, or something else? Craddock leaned forward, his pencil poised. "The jug, Mrs. Harrow, you're certain you added nothing but sugar?" Cyanide has a distinct smell, bitter, like almonds. Did you notice anything unusual? Margaret's eyes flickered, but she met his gaze. Nothing. It was just cider, fresh from our press. I'd know if something was wrong. I've been making it for 20 years. Her voice held a trace of defiance, as if daring him to doubt her. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the tension. She thought of the kitchen, its unnatural tidiness, and wondered if Margaret had scrubbed more than just the floor after finding her husband's body. The parlor offered its own silent testimony. A bookshelf held farming manuals and a few novels, their spines worn from use. A small writing desk stood in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers, among them a letter with a London postmark. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, recognizing the sharp handwriting from the village gossip about Clara Vane's persistent offers to buy the farm. Beside the desk was a ledger, its pages open to rows of figures, some circled in red ink. Debts, she suspected, or perhaps a record of arguments. She made no move to examine it, but its presence was a thread in the tapestry she was weaving. "Mrs. Harrow," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as a lullaby, "you and your husband must have worked hard to keep Greenbow thriving. It's a fine farm, the envy of the village, but farming is costly, isn't it? And there's been talk of offers to sell. Miss Vane, I believe, was quite keen." Margaret's hands tightened on the handkerchief, and for a moment her composure slipped, revealing a flash of something anger, perhaps, or fear. "Clara Vane," she said, her voice clipped, "came here 3 times this month, offering more money each time. John wouldn't hear of it. This farm's been in his family for generations. He'd sooner die than sell." She stopped abruptly, as if realizing the weight of her words, and her cheeks flushed. Craddock's pencil paused, and he glanced at Miss Marple, who gave a slight nod, encouraging him to press further. "And you, Mrs. Harrow?" he asked. "Did you agree with your husband's decision?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting to the ledger. "I wanted what was best for us," she said carefully. "The farm's been a burden lately, debts piling up, equipment breaking down. Clara's offer was generous, but John was stubborn. We argued about it, yes, but that's no crime." Her voice rose slightly, and she caught herself, smoothing her skirt with a trembling hand. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle sympathy. "Of course not, my dear. Arguments are part of marriage, aren't they? But they can weigh heavily, especially when money is tight. I remember a couple in my village, much like you and Mr. Harrow, who found themselves at odds over a similar matter. It ended sadly, though not in murder." Her tone was light, but her words carried a subtle probe, testing Margaret's reaction. The widow's face tightened, and she stood abruptly, moving to the fireplace to prod the logs with a poker. "I loved John," she said, her back to them. "He wasn't an easy man, but he was mine. I'd never harm him, no matter how we quarreled." The poker clattered against the hearth, and Miss Marple noted the force of her grip, as if channeling a deeper agitation. Craddock closed his notebook, his expression unreadable. "We'll need to search the house, Mrs. Harrow, with your permission. The cyanide had to come from somewhere, and we'll check the orchard shed as well. If you think of anything else, anything at all, please tell us." Margaret nodded, her face a mask of restraint. "Do what you must, Inspector. I want the truth as much as you do." But her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held a flicker of something guarded, as if she feared the truth as much as she sought it. As they rose to leave, Miss Marple paused by the writing desk, her fingers brushing the edge of the letter from Clara Vane. "Such a modern woman, Miss Vane," she remarked, almost to herself. "So determined. It must have been trying, having her press you so." She watched Margaret closely, noting the slight stiffening of her shoulders. "She was persistent," Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But John handled her. He always did." The words were simple, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of resentment, as if Clara Vane's presence had stirred more than just business disputes. Outside, the air was crisp, and the orchard seemed to watch them, its trees silent witnesses to the night's dark deed. Craddock walked Miss Marple to the gate, his brow furrowed. "She's holding something back," he said quietly. "But whether it's guilt or just grief, I can't tell." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "People often hold back, Inspector, until they're ready to let go. Mrs. Harrow is frightened, but of what, I wonder? Not just of losing her husband, I think." She glanced back at the farmhouse, its windows like eyes keeping their own counsel. The letter, the ledger, the handkerchief, these were fragments of a larger picture, and she felt the pattern beginning to form, though its edges remained blurred as they parted. Craddock promised to keep her informed, and Miss Marple made her way back to the vicarage, her steps slow but purposeful. Margaret Harrow was a woman under strain, her life bound to a farm that was both her pride and her burden. Miss Marple thought of another widow, long ago, whose calm exterior had hidden a desperate act. Was Margaret such a woman, or was her fear born of something or someone else? The threads were there, waiting to be woven, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, would follow them to their end. Chapter 4. The farmhands grudged the sun had climbed higher over St. Mary's Hollow, burning off the morning mist and casting a golden glow over the orchards of Greenbough Farm. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat shielding her eyes from the glare, walked the narrow path through the apple trees, her steps measured but purposeful. Inspector Craddock had agreed to let her accompany him to question Tom Rudge, the farmhand, who was said to be working in the orchard. Miss Marple had suggested the visit, citing a wish to see the famous apples for herself, but her true aim was to observe the man whose sullen demeanor had already sparked village whispers. Her knitting bag swung lightly at her side, a comforting weight, though her mind was as sharp as the pruning shears she saw glinting in the distance. The orchard was a labyrinth of green, the trees laden with fruit that promised a bountiful harvest. The air was heavy with the scent of ripe apples, undercut by the faint temps of fermenting windfalls on the ground. Tom Rudge stood near a gnarled tree, his wiry frame bent over a branch as he snipped away dead wood with practiced precision. He was a man in his early 30s, his face weathered beyond his years, with dark eyes that darted warily as Craddock and Miss Marple approached. His shirt, patched at the elbows, was stained with sweat and sap, and his hands, calloused and scarred, gripped the shears tightly, as if they were an extension of his will. "Mr. Rudge," Craddock called, his voice carrying over the rustle of leaves. "A word, if you please." Tom straightened, wiping his brow with a sleeve, his expression guarded. "What's this about, then?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew full well. He glanced at Miss Marple, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if puzzled by her presence. She smiled benignly, her demeanor that of a harmless old lady out for a stroll, but her gaze took in every detail: the mud on his boots, the faint smell of cider clinging to him, the way his fingers twitched as he set down the shears. "We're looking into John Harrow's death," Craddock said, his notebook already open. "You were here last night, working late, you said. Can you tell us exactly what you were doing?" Tom leaned against the tree, his posture casual, but his eyes alert. "I was in the barn, fixing the cider press. It's been acting up clogged rollers, loose bolts. Took me till near midnight to get it right. Harrow was particular about that press, said it was the heart of the farm." His voice was low, with a trace of bitterness that Miss Marple noted at once. She thought of a young man in St. Mary Mead, a gardener, with a similar grudge against his employer, whose resentment had simmered until it spilled over into violence. Craddock's pencil scratched across the page. "Anyone see you there? Anyone? Who can confirm you were in the barn all evening?" Tom's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "No one. I work alone most nights. Margaret was in the house, And Harrow was. Well, you know where he was. He hesitated, then added, I didn't go near the kitchen, if that's what you're thinking. I've no reason to harm him. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice gentle but probing. It must have been hard, Mr. Rudge, working for a man like Mr. Harrow. He was known for his temper, wasn't he? I've heard he could be sharp with those who worked for him. She paused, letting the words hang, her eyes never leaving his face. Tom's hands clenched, and a flush crept up his neck. He was a hard man. Paid me barely enough to live on, always barking orders, never a kind word. 10 years I gave him, and what did I get? A sore back and a few shillings. His voice rose, then fell, as if he'd caught himself. But I didn't kill him. I'm not that sort. Craddock's eyes narrowed. You had words with him, though, didn't you? The village says you and Harrow had a row last week, loud enough for the pub to hear. Tom's shoulders slumped, but he met Craddock's gaze. We argued, sure. He docked my pay for a broken crate, said it was my fault. I told him where he could shove his shillings. But that's all it was, words. He kicked at a fallen apple, sending it rolling into the grass. Miss Marple noted the gesture, the pent-up frustration it betrayed. She recalled a case where a laborer, pushed too far by a harsh master, had acted on impulse, though poison was a colder, more calculated choice. And last night, Craddock pressed, you didn't see anyone near the house. No one coming or going. Tom shook his head. I was in the barn, like I said. Didn't see a soul. The orchard's quiet at night only, the owls and the wind. His tone was flat, but Miss Marple caught a flicker in his eyes, as if he were weighing his words. She thought of the boot print in the kitchen, its deep tread so like the ones Tom wore now, caked with orchard mud. But boots were common, and suspicion was not proof. She stepped closer, her voice as soft as the breeze. You must know the farm well, Mr. Rudge, after all these years. The orchard, the sheds every corner of it. I imagine you'd notice anything out of place, wouldn't you? A stranger, perhaps, or something left where it shouldn't be. Tom's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment, she saw a spark of unease. I keep to my work, he said. Don't go poking about where I'm not needed. But his hands betrayed him, fidgeting with the shears, and Miss Marple filed the reaction away. He knew something, she thought, or feared something, but what? Craddock closed his notebook, his expression unreadable. We'll need to check the barn, Mr. Rudge, and anywhere else you were last night. If you remember anything at all, come to the station. Tom nodded, his face a mask of sullen compliance, and turned back to his pruning. As they walked away, Miss Marple glanced back, noting the way he watched them, his eyes shadowed beneath his cap. The orchard seemed to close around him, its branches like fingers guarding their secrets. At the edge of the orchard, Craddock paused, his voice low. He's not telling us everything, is he? That row with Harrow, it's more than he's letting on. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the path ahead. Resentment is a powerful thing, Inspector. It grows quietly, like a weed, until it chokes the heart. But poison requires planning, not just anger. Mr. Rudge may be bitter, but is he cunning? She thought of the cigarette stub found in the yard, its lipstick smudge an odd contrast to Tom's rough hands. Could he be protecting someone, or hiding his own guilt? They passed the shed she'd noticed earlier, its door still ajar, the lock hanging loose like a broken promise. Craddock followed her gaze. We'll search that next, he said. If there's cyanide on this farm, that's where it'll be. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Yes, and perhaps more than cyanide. People leave traces, Inspector, even when they think they've covered them. She thought of a case in her village, where a gardener's dropped glove had pointed to a thief. The shed, she suspected, held its own story, waiting to be read. As they returned to the village, the orchard's beauty seemed to mock the darkness it concealed. Tom Rudge's grudge was a thread in the pattern. but whether it led to murder or merely to silence, Miss Marple could not yet say. She walked on, her knitting bag a quiet companion, her mind weaving the clues into a tapestry that was still far from complete. Chapter 5. The neighbors' feud. The lane to Henry Gale's farm wound through a patchwork of fields, where the hedges bristled with late blackberries and the air hummed with the drone of bees. Miss Jane Marple walked beside Inspector Craddock, her parasol tapping lightly on the ground, a shield against the midday sun that had banished the morning's chill. The village of St. Mary's Hollow seemed to hold its breath, the news of John Harrow's death rippling through its quiet corners like a stone dropped in a pond. Miss Marple, her eyes bright behind her spectacles, observed the landscape with a keenness that belied her gentle demeanor. She had suggested visiting Henry Gale, the neighbor whose feud with Harrow was the stuff of village legend, and Craddock, sensing her quiet determination, had agreed. Gale's farm, Willowbank, was smaller than Greenbough, its orchard less lush, its fields patchier. The house itself was a squat, red brick affair, its paint peeling like old skin, a stark contrast to the sturdy elegance of Harrow's home. As they approached, Miss Marple noted the neglected state of the gate, its hinges, rusted, swinging loose in the breeze. A man's temper, she thought, could spill into his surroundings, and Henry Gale's temper was said to be as fierce as Harrow's own. Henry Gale stood in his yard, a burly figure in a faded corduroy jacket, his face florid beneath a battered cap. He was mending a fence, hammering nails with a force that suggested more than mere carpentry. His wife, Ellen, hovered nearby, a thin woman with anxious eyes, her hands twisting in her apron as she watched the visitors approach. Craddock raised a hand in greeting, but Gale's scowl deepened, his hammer pausing mid-swing. "What's this, then?" Gale's voice was gruff, carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being heard. "Police again. I told your constable all I know." Craddock's tone was even professional. "We're following up, Mr. Gale. This is Miss Marple, a friend of Mrs. Clements, here to assist." "We'd like to talk about John Harrow," Gale snorted, setting the hammer down with a clatter. "Harrow's dead, and I'm not shedding tears. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're after." He gestured toward the house. "Come in then. Let's get this over with." The parlor was cramped, its air heavy with the smell of damp wool and wood smoke. A single window let in a sliver of light, illuminating a table cluttered with farm ledgers and a chipped teapot. Ellen Gale offered tea, her movements jerky, as if she feared breaking the silence. Miss Marple accepted a cup, her eyes scanning the room, a pair of muddy boots by the door, their tread deep and crushed, a photograph of a younger Henry and Ellen, their smiles untroubled by the years. She noted the boots especially, recalling the print in Harrow's kitchen, its pattern a silent accusation. Craddock opened his notebook. "Mr. Gale, you and John Harrow had a dispute over a water ditch, didn't you? The village says it's been going on for years." Gale's face reddened, his hands clenching on the table. "Aye, and for good reason. That ditch feeds my fields as much as his, but Harrow diverted it last spring, left my crops parched. Said it was his right, his land being bigger. Arrogant sod." His voice rose, and Ellen flinched, her teacup rattling. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm against the storm of Gale's words. "And you argued about it?" Craddock pressed, his pencil poised. "Argued. I near knocked his head off." Gale's laugh was harsh, but it faded quickly. "Not literally, mind. We shouted, sure, down at the Red Lion, last month. I told him he'd regret crossing me, but poison, that's not my way. I'd have used my fists, not some sneaky chemical." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of polite interest. "It must have been trying, Mr. Gale, seeing your fields suffer while Greenbough thrived. I knew a farmer once, in my village, who took such disputes to heart. It changed him, made him bitter. But bitterness doesn't always lead to murder, does it?" Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the crack in his bluster. Gale's gaze met hers, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes, defiance, perhaps, or unease. "I'm no murderer," he said gruffly. "Harrow was a thorn, but I didn't need him dead to settle things. My farm's holding its own." Ellen spoke up, her voice thin but insistent. "Henry was here last night, Inspector. All evening, after supper. We sat by the fire, talking about the harvest. He never left the house." Her words were firm, but her hands trembled, and Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the way her eyes darted to her husband before returning to her lap. Craddock jotted a note. "Can anyone else confirm that, Mrs. Gale? A neighbor, perhaps, or a visitor?" Ellen shook her head, her fingers twisting tighter in her apron. "It was just us. The village was quiet. No one came by." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple thought of another wife, years ago, whose alibi for her husband had crumbled under the weight of a single lie. Ellen's nervousness was a thread, but whether it led to guilt or merely fear, she could not yet say. The boots by the door drew Miss Marple's attention again. Their tread was identical to the one in Harrow's kitchen, but such boots were common in a farming village, worn by men like Gale and Tom Rudge alike. She made a mental note to ask Craddock about the print's size and depth, details that might narrow the field. She also noticed a faint smudge of mud on the parlor floor, leading from the boots to the hearth, as if someone had paced restlessly. A small thing, but Miss Marple knew that small things could unravel great secrets. "Mr. Gale," she said, her voice as soft as a summer breeze, "you must know the comings and goings around here. Did you see anyone near Greenbough last night? A stranger, perhaps, or someone out of place?" Gale's eyes narrowed, but he shook his head. "Didn't see nothing. I was here, like Ellen said. The orchard's too far to spot anyone skulking about." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the slight shift in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed. He was holding something back, she thought, though whether it was knowledge or guilt, she could not yet tell. Craddock stood, closing his notebook. "We'll need to look around your property, Mr. Gale, with your permission. The cyanide had to come from somewhere, and we're checking all the farms." Gale grunted, his expression sour. "Do what you must. You'll find nothing here but hard work and bad luck." He rose, towering over them, and Miss Marple noted the strength in his frame, the kind that could break a man's jaw or slip poison into a jug, if driven to it. As they stepped outside, Ellen followed, her voice low. "Inspector, please, Henry's a good man. He's angry, yes, but he'd never kill. He loved this land, even with all its troubles." Her eyes pleaded, but Miss Marple saw the strain in them, the weight of unspoken fears. Craddock nodded, his face impassive. "We're just gathering facts, Mrs. Gale. If he's innocent, he's nothing to fear." But his tone held a note of skepticism, and Miss Marple understood why. Alibis built on a wife's word were fragile, especially when the wife seemed afraid of her own truth. As they walked back to the lane, Miss Marple glanced at the boots again, now in the yard where Gale had resumed his work. The mud on them was fresh, like that in Harrow's kitchen, but the village paths were muddy this time of year. She thought of the cigarette stub found near Greenbough's gate, its lipstick smudge, a jarring note in this rustic drama. Could Gale have a connection to someone like Clara Vane? Or was the stub a distraction, left to mislead? Craddock broke the silence, his voice low. "Gale's got a temper, and that feud gives him motive. But poison's a strange choice for a man like him. He strikes me as the type to settle scores face to face." Miss Marple nodded, her parasol tapping the ground. "Yes, Inspector, but people surprise us. A man may shout and bluster, yet choose a quieter way to kill. I knew a butcher once, loud as thunder, who poisoned a rival's well. It's the heart, not the voice, that matters." She paused, her eyes on the distant orchard. "And Mrs. Gale, she's frightened, isn't she? Not just of us, but of something closer. Craddock's brow furrowed. You think she's covering for him? Or protecting herself? Miss Marple said softly. Fear has many faces, Inspector. We must find the one she wears. As they reached the village, the church bell tolled, a somber note that seemed to echo the weight of their task. Henry Gale's feud was a thread in the pattern, but whether it led to murder or merely to anger, Miss Marple could not yet say. The boots, the mud, Ellen's trembling hands, these were pieces of a puzzle, and she would fit them together, as she always did, with patience and a clear eye. Chapter 6. The Buyer from London. The village inn of St. Mary's Hollow. The Three Crows stood at the crossroads where the lane to Greenbough Farm met the high street. Its whitewashed walls and sagging timbers gave it an air of cozy antiquity, but the sleek black motorcar parked outside struck a jarring note, like a city shoe on a muddy path. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn against the evening chill, approached the inn with Inspector Craddock, her step light but her mind alert. The village had been abuzz with talk of Clara Vane, the London cider buyer whose persistent offers to purchase Greenbough Farm had stirred both curiosity and suspicion. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, had suggested they speak with her next, and Craddock, though skeptical of her methods, had come to value the glint in her eye. Inside, the inn was warm and dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of ale and wood smoke. A few locals huddled at the bar, their voices low, their glances darting toward the corner where Clara Vane sat alone, a glass of sherry untouched before her. She was a woman in her early 40s, with the polished elegance of the city. Her auburn hair was swept into a neat chignon, her tailored suit a sharp contrast to the village's homespun attire. Her face, angular and composed, betrayed no hint of unease, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tapped lightly on the table, a rhythm of impatience or nerves. Craddock approached, his hat in hand. Miss Vane, I'm Inspector Craddock, investigating John Harrow's death. This is Miss Marple assisting us. May we have a word? Clara's eyes flicked up, cool and assessing, lingering on Miss Marple with a faint curiosity before returning to Craddock. Of course, Inspector, she said, her voice smooth, with the clipped precision of one accustomed to boardrooms. Please, sit. I've been expecting you. They took seats across from her, the table a small island in the inn's murmur. Miss Marple placed her knitting bag beside her, her hands folded demurely, though her gaze was as sharp as a needle. The innkeeper, a stout man named Mr. Pym, hovered nearby, polishing glasses with a cloth that looked none too clean. Miss Marple noted his attentiveness, wondering if it was mere curiosity or something bought with a city woman's coin. Craddock opened his notebook, his tone businesslike. Miss Vane, you've been in St. Mary's Hollow for some weeks, negotiating to buy Greenbough Farm. Can you tell us about your dealings with John Harrow? Clara leaned back, her posture relaxed but her eyes keen. John Harrow was a stubborn man, Inspector, but his cider was exceptional. My company, Vane & Sons, supplies high-end markets in London, and Greenbough's output was unmatched. I offered him a fair price, more than fair, given the farm's debts. He refused, repeatedly. Said the land was his legacy. Her lips curved, in a faint smile, tinged with exasperation. I don't give up easily, but I wasn't here to force his hand. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice soft but probing. It must have been frustrating, Miss Vane, to come so far and meet such resistance. I knew a businessman once, in my village, who took rejection hard. It made him creative in his methods. Her tone was gentle, but the words carried a subtle challenge, and Clara's smile tightened. I'm not one for tantrums, Miss Marple, she replied, her voice cool. Business is business. If Harrow wouldn't sell, I'd find another supplier. There are other orchards. But her fingers stilled on the table, and Miss Marple noted the faint tension in her jaw, as if the rejection had stung more than she admitted. Craddock flipped a page in his notebook. Where were you last night, Miss Vane? Between, say, 8 and midnight. Clara sipped her sherry, her movements deliberate. I was here, in my room upstairs. I had letters to write, business correspondence. Mr. Pym can confirm I didn't leave the inn. Her tone was confident, but Miss Marple caught the slight glance toward the bar, where Pym was still polishing, his eyes studiously averted. And you didn't visit Greenbough Farm, Craddock pressed. Not even to speak with Harrow one last time. Clara's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained steady. No, Inspector. I hadn't seen Harrow since 2 days ago, when I made my final offer. He sent me away, quite rudely, I might add. She paused, then added, I heard about his death this morning. A terrible thing, but I had no part in it. Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly, a soothing counterpoint to the tension. She thought of the cigarette stub found near Greenbough's gate, its lipstick smudge, a vivid scarlet that matched the shade Clara wore now. The stub was a small thing, but in her experience, small things could unravel great lies. She also recalled the open shed door, the broken lock, a place someone like Clara, with her city cunning, might have explored. You must know a great deal about cider, Miss Vane, she said, her voice mild. The making of it, the tools, the materials. Farms like Greenbough have their secrets, don't they? Things like pest control, perhaps. Clara's gaze sharpened, but she smiled. I know enough to judge quality, Miss Marple. The rest is for farmers, not buyers. I leave the dirty work to them. Her tone was light, but there was an edge to it, as if she sensed the trap in the old lady's words. Craddock leaned forward, his pencil poised. We found a cigarette stub near the farm's gate, Miss Vane, with lipstick on it. Do you smoke? Clara's smile didn't waver, but her fingers twitched, brushing the edge of her glass. Occasionally, Inspector, a habit from London, but I don't recall smoking near Greenbough. The village lanes are muddy. Prefer to stay clean. She gestured to her immaculate suit, but Miss Marple noted the faintest smudge on her sleeve, barely visible, as if brushed against something dusty, like the inside of a shed. The innkeeper, Pym, approached with a fresh pot of tea, his movements slow, as if reluctant to intrude. Miss Vane was here all evening, he said, unprompted, his voice gruff. Saw her go up to her room after supper, around 8. Didn't see her leave till breakfast. His eyes flicked to Clara, and Miss Marple caught the exchange, brief but telling. Money, she thought, could buy silence, and Clara Vane had the means. Craddock nodded, jotting a note. Thank you, Mr. Pym. We'll check with the other guests. Of course. His tone was polite, but Miss Marple knew he shared her skepticism. An innkeeper's word was only as good as his loyalty, and loyalty could be swayed. As they rose to leave, Miss Marple paused, her eyes lingering on Clara's handbag, a sleek leather affair on the table. A faint scent of perfume clung to it, sharp and floral, not unlike the cigarette stub's lingering trace. You must find our little village dull, Miss Vane, she said, her voice warm with neighborly charm. All this talk of orchards and feuds. But I suppose ambition finds a way, even in a place like St. Mary's Hollow. Clara's smile was tight, her eyes cool. Ambition is my trade, Miss Marple, but I don't let it cloud my judgment. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and Miss Marple noted the grace of her movements. The confidence of a woman who knew her power. Yet power, she knew, could breed desperation when thwarted. Outside, the evening air was cool, the village settling. Into dusk, Craddock walked Miss Marple back toward the vicarage, his brow furrowed. She's too smooth, he said, his voice low. That alibi's convenient, and Pym's too quick to back her up. I'll have my men check her room, see if there's anything, cigarettes, letters, anything tying her to the farm. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the darkening lane. Miss Vane is clever, Inspector, and clever people make careful plans. But they also make mistakes, small ones, that betray them. That cigarette stub, for instance, It's not the sort of thing a careful woman leaves behind by accident. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a dropped earring had pointed to a thief. Clara's polish was her armor, but armor could have chinks. The church bell tolled its sound, carrying over the fields, a reminder of time's relentless march. Clara Vane was a thread in the pattern, her ambition a bright, sharp strand, but whether it led to murder or merely to greed, Miss Marple could not yet say. The perfume, the lipstick, the innkeeper's glance, these were pieces of the puzzle, and she would place them carefully, as she always did, until the truth emerged from the shadows. Chapter 7. The Village Gossip. The vicarage at St. Mary's Hollow was a haven of quiet warmth, its sitting room aglow with the soft flicker of a coal fire. Miss Jane Marple sat in a chintz-covered armchair, her knitting needles moving with a rhythm, as steady as a metronome, the soft click-click, a counterpoint to the patter of rain against the windows. It was late afternoon, and the village, subdued by the drizzle and the weight of John Harrow's death, seemed to draw inward, its secrets simmering beneath the surface. Mrs. Lucy Clement, the vicar's wife, bustled in with a tea tray, her cheeks flushed from the kitchen's heat, her eyes bright with the eager curiosity that village tragedies often stirred. "Jane, you must be exhausted," Mrs. Clement said, setting the tray on a low table. "All this traipsing about with Inspector Craddock, poking into dreadful things. Have some teats Darjeeling, the good kind." She poured with a flourish, her hands steady, despite the excitement in her voice. Miss Marple smiled, accepting a cup, her eyes crinkling with warmth but her mind as sharp as ever, sifting through the day's discoveries like a jeweler sorting gems. "Thank you, Lucy," she said, her voice gentle. "But it's not the traipsing that tires one, it's the thinking. People's words, you know, are like threads in a tapestry. They seem simple enough, but they weave such complicated patterns." She sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the window, where the rain blurred the view of the church spire. The village gossip, she knew, was as vital to her work as any police report, and Mrs. Clement, with her ear for every whisper, was a treasure trove. Mrs. Clement settled into the opposite chair, her hand smoothing her apron. "Well, the village is in a state, I can tell you. They're all talking about poor John Harrow poisoned in his own kitchen. Mrs. Bantry at the shop says it's the wife, Margaret, mark her words. Says she's been looking pinched lately, as if money's tight. And then there's Tom Rougeau, Jane, he's a surly one. They say he threatened Harrow at the Red Lion, right in front of half the village." Her voice dropped, conspiratorial. "And Henry Gale, well, that feud over the ditch has been going on forever. He's got a temper like a bull, that man." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes bright with interest. "And Miss Vane, Lucy, what does the village say about her?" She leaned forward slightly, her tone casual but her attention keen. Clara Vane, with her city polish and persistent offers, was an outsider, and villages, she knew, were quick to suspect those who didn't belong. Mrs. Clement's eyes widened, delighted to share. "Oh, Clara Vane's the talk of the shop. Mrs. Bantry says she's been asking all sorts of questions about the farm's value, its debts, even how many acres it covers. Not just business questions, mind you, but personal ones. She asked old Mr. Pym at the inn about Margaret's habits, whether she was the sort to stand by her husband or, well, push him aside." She lowered her voice, as if the walls might overhear. "And there's talk she was seen near the orchard 2 nights ago, though no one's sure who saw her. You know how gossip grows." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the details. The orchard sighting was new, a thread that might tie to the cigarette stub with its telltale lipstick. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stranger's questions about a local family had led to theft. Not murder, but the pattern was similar. Curiosity, masking intent. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft. "How people notice things, but don't always speak them aloud." I wonder what else they've seen, these neighbors of ours. Mrs. Clement seized the bait, leaning forward. Well, there's more. Young Billy Tanner, the baker's boy, swears he saw Tom Rudge near Greenbow's back gate at dusk, the night Harrow died. He didn't tell anyone till this morning, afraid of getting involved, I suppose. And Mrs. Pym, the innkeeper's wife, says she heard a car engine late that night, past 10, which is odd for the village. Could have been Clara Vane's car, though she won't say so outright. She paused, then added, and Margaret thinks she was in church last Sunday, crying during the sermon. Mrs. Bantry says it was about money troubles, but I think it was more than that. She looked haunted. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind weaving the gossip into the pattern she was forming. Margaret's tears, Tom's presence at the gate, Clara's car, these were fragments, each carrying a hint of truth or deception. She recalled a woman in her village whose public tears had masked a private scheme, and wondered if Margaret's grief was as simple as it seemed. Tom's sullenness, too, suggested more than mere resentment. Was he hiding? A meeting, a witness, or something darker? And Clara, with her probing questions, was painting herself as a figure of calculation, perhaps too clever for her own good. Lucy, Miss Marple said, setting her cup down, you've a gift for hearing what matters. These little stories, they're like breadcrumbs, leading us somewhere. But we must be careful not to follow the wrong trail. She paused, her eyes distant. I knew a girl once, in St. Mary Mead, who spread gossip to hide her own misdeeds. It worked, for a time, until someone noticed her shoes didn't match her story. Mrs. Clement laughed, though her eyes were serious. You make it sound so simple, Jane, but how do you know what's true and what's just talk? Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. Truth has a way of showing itself, Lucy, if you watch closely. It's in the way people move, the things they don't say. Margaret's tears, Tom's threats, Henry's temper, Clara's questions, they all mean something, but not always what they seem. She picked up her knitting, the wool slipping through her fingers like time itself. Tell me, has anyone mentioned the orchard shed? Whether it's been used lately, or if anything's gone missing? Mrs. Clement frowned, thinking, not directly. But old Mr. Tanner, he delivers eggs to the farm, said he saw the shed door open yesterday morning, before the police came. Thought it odd, since Harrow was so particular about locking it. Said it looked like someone had been in there, rummaging. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper. Do you think it's where the poison came from? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained serene. It's possible, Lucy. Sheds are private places, aren't they? Full of tools and secrets. I think I'll ask Inspector Craddock to take a closer look. She made a mental note of the shed, its broken lock, a detail that tugged at her mind. The cyanide, she suspected, had come from there, but who had taken it tanned? Why was still a nod to untangle? The rain had eased, and the firelight cast shadows on the vicarage walls, dancing like the village's secrets. Mrs. Clement rose to clear the tray, but paused, her hands hovering. Jane, do you think it's one of them, Margaret, Tom, Henry, or Clara? Or could it be someone else, someone we haven't thought of? Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. It's always someone, Lucy, and in a village like this, it's rarely a stranger. The answer's here, in the things people say and the things they don't. We just need to listen. She thought of the cigarette stub, the boot print, the ledger in Margaret's parlor, each a clue waiting to be placed. The gossip was a map, imperfect but guiding, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, would follow it to its end. As Mrs. Clement bustled out, promising to bring scones, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind alive with the village's voices. The pattern was growing clearer, its threads grief, resentment, anger, ambition twisting together. But which thread led to murder, and which to mere human frailty. She would find out, as she always did, by watching, listening, and letting the truth unravel itself. Chapter 8. A clue in the orchard. The rain had ceased, leaving the air of St. Mary's Hollow heavy with the scent of damp earth and bruised apples. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible coat buttoned against the lingering chill, walked the path through Greenbough Farm's orchard, her eyes scanning the ground with the quiet intensity of a hawk. Inspector Craddock had agreed to her request to revisit the farm, though his tone suggested he humored her more than he believed in her instincts. The orchard, with its rows of ancient trees, stretched like a silent congregation, their branches heavy with fruit that seemed to mock the tragedy at their heart. Miss Marple's knitting bag swung lightly at her side, a familiar companion, but her mind was far from domestic, piecing together the fragments of the village's secrets. The morning's gossip at the vicarage had stirred her curiosity, particularly Mrs. Clement's mention of the orchard shed's open door. The shed, with its broken lock, was a detail that tugged at her like a loose thread in a shawl. Cyanide, she knew, was not a casual tool. It required access, intent, and opportunity. The shed, tucked at the orchard's edge, was a likely hiding place for such a poison, and Miss Marple intended to see it for herself before the police tramped through. Disturbing its subtle clues, the shed came into view. A weathered structure of splintered wood, its roof sagging under the weight of years. The door hung ajar, the lock dangling uselessly, its metal rusted and snapped. Miss Marple paused, her gaze sweeping the surrounding ground. The mud was soft from the rain, marked by a confusion of footprints, some deep, some faint, but none as distinct as the boot print in Harrow's kitchen. She noted a patch of flattened grass nearby, as if someone had stood there, watching or waiting. A small thing, but Miss Marple knew that small things could unravel great mysteries, like the time a trampled flower bed in St. Mary Mead had pointed to a thief's midnight escape. Craddock caught up, his notebook tucked under his arm. "You've a sharp eye for these places, Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of respect and amusement. "What are we looking for, exactly?" She smiled, her expression serene but her eyes alight. "Oh, Inspector, it's not always what we look for, but what we find. A shed like this holds more than tools. You know, it's a place where people come and go, leaving traces they don't mean to." She stepped closer to the shed, careful not to disturb the ground, her parasol tapping lightly as she peered inside. The interior was dim, cluttered with sacks of fertilizer, coils of rope, and a rusty cider press in the corner. The air carried a faint chemical temps, not unlike the bitter scent in Harrow's kitchen. Miss Marple's gaze fell on a shelf lined with jars and bottles, their labels faded but legible: weed killer, insect repellent, and, tucked behind a sack of grain, a small glass vial, its stopper loose. She pointed it out to Craddock, her voice soft but firm. "There, Inspector. I shouldn't touch it, but I suspect that's what we're looking for." Craddock donned gloves and carefully retrieved the vial, holding it to the light. It was half empty, its contents a colorless liquid that gave off a faint almond-like odor. "Cyanide, I'd wager," he said, his voice tight. "We'll send it to the lab, but this could be our murder weapon." "Good spot, Miss Marple." He sealed the vial in an evidence bag, his expression sobering as he realized the shed's significance. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes roving the shed's interior. A pile of sacks in the corner caught her attention, their burlap edges frayed. She bent closer, her movements slow, and noticed something half buried in the dirt floor: a cigarette stub, its tip smudged with scarlet lipstick, identical to the one found near the farm's gate. She straightened, her face betraying nothing, but her mind raced. Clara Vane's shade of lipstick was unmistakable, but the stub's presence here, in this secluded shed, suggested more than a careless smoke. Had she come to steal the cyanide, or to hide it? Or was someone else, someone familiar with her habits, planting a false trail. "Inspector," she said, pointing to the stub, "you might want to bag that as well. It's curious, isn't it, how the same clue keeps appearing, almost as if someone wants us to notice." Her tone was mild, but her words carried a weight that made Craddock pause, his eyes narrowing as he retrieved the stub. "You think it's deliberate?" he asked, his voice low. "Someone framing Miss Vane?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Or someone careless, Inspector. People are so predictable in their habits, aren't they? But sometimes they're too predictable, and that's when you know they're trying to be clever." She thought of a case in her village where a dropped handkerchief had been left to mislead, only to betray the true culprit's haste. The stub, she suspected, was a piece of the puzzle. But whether it pointed to Clara or away from her, she could not yet say. They stepped outside, the orchard's stillness pressing around them. Craddock scanned the trees, his brow furrowed. "This shed's too easy to get into. Margaret says it's usually locked, but anyone could have broken that lock. Tom Rudge, Henry Gale, even Clara Vane, or Margaret herself. For that matter." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the flattened grass. "Yes, but breaking a lock makes noise, doesn't it? And leaves marks. That lock looks old, Inspector, as if it's been broken for some time. Whoever came here knew it was open, or made it so, beforehand." She paused, her gaze drifting to a nearby tree, where a scrap of cloth snagged on a low branch caught her eye, a thread of gray wool, fine and city-made, unlike the coarse fabric of village clothing. She plucked it carefully, holding it up to the light. "Now, this is interesting," she murmured. "Not the sort of thing a farmer wears, is it?" Craddock took the thread, his expression skeptical but intrigued. "Could be nothing, just a visitor's coat catching as they passed, but I'll have it checked." "You've a knack for spotting these things, Miss Marple." She smiled, tucking her parasol under her arm. "I only notice what's there, Inspector. People leave pieces of themselves behind, even when they think they're careful." She thought of Clara Vane's tailored suit, the gray wool of her coat, and wondered if the thread was hers or a deliberate plant to cast suspicion. She also recalled Tom Rudge's sullen presence in the orchard, his boots muddy, his hands restless. Could he have come here, perhaps to meet someone? Or Henry Gale, with his feud-fueled anger? Even Margaret, with her access to the shed, could not be dismissed. As they walked back through the orchard, the apples gleamed in the sunlight, their beauty a stark contrast to the darkness they concealed. Craddock spoke, his voice thoughtful. "This shed changes things. If the cyanide came from here, it narrows our search, but it also means someone planned this new. Where to find the poison, knew Harrow's habits." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the path ahead. "Planning, yes, and patience. Poison is a waiting game, Inspector. It requires a cool head, not a hot one." She thought of the suspects. Margaret's strained grief, Tom's simmering resentment, Henry's blustering temper, Clara's calculated ambition. Each could have planned, but which had the patience to execute? The thread, the stub, the broken lock, these were clues, but the truth lay in their arrangement. At the farm's gate, Craddock paused, his notebook open. "I'll have my men comb the shed thoroughly. If there's more to find, we'll find it. Anything else you'd suggest, Miss Marple?" She adjusted her shawl, her expression serene. "Only to listen, Inspector. The village is talking, and it always has more to say. Someone saw something, a shadow in the orchard, a car in the lane. They just haven't realized it matters yet." She thought of Mrs. Clement's gossip, the baker's boy, and the innkeeper's wife, their stories waiting to be sifted for truth. As they parted, the orchard seemed to watch, its silence heavy with secrets. Miss Marple walked back to the vicarage, her mind weaving the new clues into the pattern. The vial, the stub, the thread. The shed was a turning point, a place where intent had met opportunity. but the hand that had acted remained hidden. She would find it, as she always did, by following the threads to their source. Chapter 9. The widow's secret. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Greenbough Farm's parlor, casting delicate shadows that danced across the polished oak floor. Miss Jane Marple sat once more in the backed chair, her knitting bag at her feet, its contents untouched, as she fixed her gaze on Margaret Harrow. The widow stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly. Her morning dress a somber contrast to the room's faded warmth. Inspector Craddock, his notebook open, stood near the door, his presence a quiet anchor in the tense atmosphere. The discovery of the cyanide vial in the orchard shed had shifted the investigation, and Miss Marple had insisted on returning to question Margaret further. Sensing that the widow's guarded demeanor hid more than grief, the rain had returned, a soft patter against the windows, sealing the room in a cocoon of secrets. Craddock held up the evidence bag containing the vial, its glass glinting faintly. "Mrs. Harrow," he began, his voice steady but firm, "we found this in the orchard shed. Cyanide, likely the same used to poison your husband. You said you kept such things for pest control, locked away. Care to explain why the lock was broken?" Margaret's face paled, her eyes darting to the vial, before settling on her hands. I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "We do keep cyanide for wasps' nests, mostly. John was particular about it, always locked the shed himself. I haven't been in there in weeks." Her fingers twisted the handkerchief she held, its lace edge fraying under the strain. Miss Marple noted the gesture, recalling how Margaret's new handkerchief had caught her eye before. Was it a prop for grief, or a shield for guilt? Craddock's eyes narrowed, his pencil poised. "The lock's been broken for some time, Mrs. Harrow. Rusty, snapped clean. You're telling me you didn't notice? You live here, manage the farm. That shed's not far from the house." Margaret's shoulders stiffened, and she turned to face him, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and defiance. "I've been busy, Inspector. The farm's falling apart, debts, broken equipment, John's temper. I don't go poking about in sheds. That was his domain." Her voice cracked, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips, as if to stifle a sob. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the tension, her mind sifting through Margaret's words. The widow's distress seemed genuine, but there was an edge to it, a note of calculation that reminded her of a woman in St. Mary Mead, whose tears had masked a deeper motive. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. "It must be a heavy burden, Mrs. Harrow, running a farm like this, with so many worries. I understand you and Mr. Harrow had disagreements, perhaps, about money. The village talks of debts, and of Miss Vane's offers to buy. It would tempt anyone, wouldn't it, to ease such a load?" Her tone was kind, almost maternal, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the crack in Margaret's composure. Margaret's gaze flicked to the writing desk, where the ledger in Clara Vane's letter still lay. "We had our troubles," she admitted, her voice low. "The farm's mortgaged, the hilt repairs, bad harvests, John's stubbornness. Clara Vane came with her offers, waving money like it was nothing. I told John we should consider it, just to breathe again. He wouldn't hear of it, said the farm was his blood, his family's legacy." She paused, her eyes glistening. "We argued, yes, but I loved him. I'd never." Her voice broke, and she turned away, facing the fire. Craddock seized the opening, his tone sharper. "You argued the night he died, didn't you? Mrs. Bantry at the shop heard you, through the open window." Raised voices. "Something about selling. Care to tell us what that was about?" Margaret's hands froze, the handkerchief crumpling in her fist. For a moment, she seemed to shrink, then she straightened, her face a mask of resolve. "It was nothing new," she said. "John was going over the accounts, railing about the debts. I said Clara's offer could save us, Give us a fresh start. He shouted me down, called me a traitor to his name. I went to bed, left him to his cider and his temper. Her voice was steady now, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes avoided the ledger. The parlor held its own silent clues. The letter from Clara Vane, its envelope creased as if handled often, lay atop the ledger, its figures a stark testament to the farm's struggles. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a small photograph on the mantel, half hidden behind a vase. Margaret and John, younger, smiling in an orchard, their hands entwined. The contrast with Margaret's strained face now was stark, and Miss Marple wondered if love had soured into desperation, or if something else drove her fear. "Mrs. Harrow," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as the rain outside, "you must have been terribly worried, with all this hanging over you. I knew a woman once, in my village, who faced similar troubles. She kept a secret, thinking it would protect her, but it only made things worse. Is there anything you haven't told us? Something that might help us understand?" Margaret's eyes met hers, and for a moment, a shadow crossed her face. Guilt, perhaps, or shame. "I've told you everything," she said, but her voice wavered, and she turned back to the fire, poking at the logs with unnecessary force. The poker clattered against the hearth, and Miss Marple noted the strength in her grip, the kind that could break a lock or wield a subtler weapon. Craddock closed his notebook, his expression unreadable. "We'll need to search the house again, Mrs. Harrow, and the shed thoroughly. If that cyanide came from your farm, someone knew where to find it. If you remember anything at all, come to the station." Margaret nodded, her face pale but composed. "Do what you must, Inspector. I want whoever did this found. John deserved better." Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of something in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or a deeper secret. As they stepped into the rain-soaked yard, Craddock pulled his coat tighter, his brow furrowed. "She's not telling us the whole truth," he said, his voice low. "That argument tits more than she's letting on, and the shed, so close to the house. She must have known the lock was broken." Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her eyes on the orchard's shadowy trees. "Yes, Inspector, but fear can silence even the most honest heart. Margaret is afraid of us, perhaps, or of what she knows. But whether it's guilt or something else, we must find out." She thought of the cigarette stub, its lipstick, a vivid clue, and the gray wool thread from the shed. Did they point to Clara Vane, or was Margaret's fear tied to another's presence? The ledger, too, with its red-circled debts, suggested a motive that could drive a desperate act. The rain fell harder as they walked back to the village, the path slick underfoot. Miss Marple's mind was alive with the day's threads, Margaret's guarded words, the vial's bitter scent, the shed's broken lock. Each was a piece of the pattern, but the shape of the truth remained elusive. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a wife's silence had hidden, not her guilt, but her shame at her husband's betrayal. Was Margaret protecting herself, or someone else? The answer, Miss Marple knew, lay in the spaces between her words, and she would listen closely until they spoke. Chapter 10. The Farmhand's Confession. The dusk settled over St. Mary's Hollow, like a soft gray veil, the air thick with the scent of wet leaves, and the distant promise of autumn's harvest. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn tightly against the evening's chill, followed Inspector Craddock along the orchard path to Greenbough Farm's barn, where Tom Rudge had agreed to meet them. The discovery of the cyanide vial and the lipstick-stained cigarette stub in the shed had tightened the web of suspicion, and Miss Marple's quiet suggestion to revisit the farmhand had met with Craddock's ready approval. Her knitting bag hung at her side, its weight a familiar comfort, but her mind was a whirl of sharp observations, piecing together the village's tangled threads. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered timbers silvered by the fading light, the scent of hay and machine oil mingling with the orchard's sweetness. Tom Rudge stood in the doorway, his lean frame silhouetted against the glow of a lantern inside. His cap was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, and his hands, stained with grease from the cider press, fidgeted with a rag as he watched their approach. Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. He was a man on edge, she thought, and men on edge often let slip what they meant to hide. "Mr. Rudge," Craddock began, his voice calm but authoritative, "we need to talk again about the shed and what we found there." He held up the evidence bag containing the cigarette stub, its scarlet smudge vivid even in the dim light. "This was in the orchard shed, near the cyanide vial. Care to tell us anything about it?" Tom's eyes widened, and he took a step back, his rag twisting in his hands. "I don't know nothing about that," he said, his voice rough. "I told you, I was in the barn that night, fixing the press. Didn't go near the shed." His gaze darted to Miss Marple, then away, as if her quiet presence unnerved him more than Craddock's official air. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle concern. "It must be difficult, Mr. Rudge, working so hard for so little, thanks. I knew a young man once, in my village, who felt much the same. He kept quiet about something he saw, thinking it would protect him, but it only made things worse. Her voice was soft, almost coaxing, but her eyes were sharp, watching the flicker of unease cross Tom's face. He shifted his weight, the rag now a tight knot in his fists. "I ain't hiding nothing," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Craddock stepped closer, his notebook open, and Tom's shoulders slumped, as if the weight of scrutiny was too much to bear. "Mr. Rudge," Craddock said, his tone firm, "we know you were near the farm's back gate that night. Billy Tanner saw you. And now this cigarette stub, in the shed where the cyanide was kept. If you know something, now's the time to say it. Keeping quiet won't help you." Tom's face flushed, and he tossed the rag onto a nearby crate, his hand shaking. All right, he burst out, his voice cracking. "I saw something, but I didn't want no trouble. That night, I was in the orchard, not just the barn. I saw Clara Vayner, with her fancy coat near the shed. She was acting odd, looking around like she didn't want to be seen. I didn't think much of it then, just figured she was snooping for her business. But after Harrow died, he trailed off, his eyes fixed on the ground. Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly, a steady rhythm in the tense silence. "And you didn't tell anyone, Mr. Rudge?" she asked, her voice mild but probing. "Not even when you heard about the poison? That's a heavy burden to carry, isn't it, knowing you might have seen the killer?" Tom's head snapped up, his eyes wild. "I ain't saying she's the killer. I just saw her, that's all. I didn't want to get mixed up in it. Harrow was bad enough alive, always on my case. I didn't need the police thinking I had something to do with it." His voice was raw, and Miss Marple noted the fear in it, the kind that came from more than just a bad employer. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a servant's silence had hidden not guilt but a fear of retribution. Was Tom protecting himself, or someone else? Craddock's pencil scratched across the page, his expression unreadable. What time was this, and what exactly was she doing? Tom rubbed his neck, his face a mask of reluctance. Must have been around 9, maybe a bit later. She was by the shed, standing near the door. Looked like she was holding something, couldn't see what, it was dark. She didn't see me. I was in the shadows, heading back to the barn. I didn't stay to watch, thought. She was just nosing about, like she always did." His voice faltered, and he added, "I swear, that's all I know." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained gentle. "You're sure it was Miss Vane, Mr. Rudge? The orchard's dark at night, and shadows can play tricks. It would be a pity to mistake one person for another." Her tone was kind, but the question was a needle, probing for truth. Tom's jaw tightened, and he nodded. It was her, that coat of hers gray, fancy, not like anything round here. and her hair, pinned up like always. I know what I saw, but his hands shook, and Miss Marple wondered if his certainty was as firm as he claimed. A gray coat, a pinned chignon, these were details Clara Vane wore like a uniform. But uniforms could be mimicked or mistaken. Craddock closed his notebook, his gaze steady. We'll check this with Miss Vane, Mr. Rudge. If you're lying or holding back, it'll go worse for you. And we'll need to search the barn, see if your story about the press holds up. Tom nodded, his face pale. Search all you want. I was here, fixing that blasted press. You'll see the tools I used, the grease on 'em. He gestured to the barn's interior, where a workbench was cluttered with wrenches and oil cans, the cider press gleaming faintly in the lantern's light. Miss Marple noted the orderliness of the tools, unusual for a man so agitated. Had he tidied them, perhaps, to bolster his alibi? As they stepped inside, her eyes swept the barn's shadows. A pile of burlap sacks lay in a corner, their edges frayed like those in the shed. A faint glint caught her attention, a small metal button, half buried in the straw, its surface engraved with a simple design. She bent to retrieve it, her movements slow, and held it up to the light. Curious, she murmured, passing it to Craddock. Not the sort of thing one expects in a barn, is it? A city button, perhaps? Craddock examined it, his brow furrowing. Could be nothing, but we'll check it against the suspect's clothing. Good eye, Miss Marple. He bagged the button, his expression thoughtful. Miss Marple's mind turned to Clara Vane's tailored coat, its buttons, sleek and modern, but also to Margaret Harrow's morning dress, which might hide such a detail. Even Henry Gale's wife, Ellen, with her nervous hands, could have lost something in a moment of haste. They left Tom in the barn, his figure slumped against the workbench, the lantern casting long shadows across his face. As they walked back through the orchard, Craddock spoke, his voice low. He's scared, isn't he? But is it because he saw Clara, or because he's hiding something else? That button, it's another piece that doesn't fit? Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her eyes on the darkening trees. Fear makes people clumsy, Inspector. Tom saw something, I think, but whether it's the whole truth, I'm not sure. That button, the cigarette stub there like breadcrumbs, leading us somewhere, but we must be careful not to follow a false trail. She thought of a case in her village, where a dropped glove had seemed to point to one suspect, only two, reveal another's cunning. Tom's confession was a thread, but whether it led to Clara, or tangled him deeper, she could not yet say. The orchard's silence enveloped them as they reached the village lane, the stars beginning to prick the sky. Miss Marple's mind was alive with the day's clues. Tom's trembling hands, the button's glint, the shed's broken lock. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and she would place them carefully, as she always did, until the pattern revealed the hand that had poured the poison. Chapter 11. The Buyer's Motive. The vicarage sitting room was a sanctuary of soft lamplight and the faint aroma of beeswax polish, its walls lined with books that spoke of the vicar's scholarly bent. Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her eyes bright with the quiet intensity of a mind at work. The rain had stopped, leaving the evening air crisp, and the village of St. Mary's Hollow seemed to huddle under a starlit sky, its secrets pressing closer with each passing hour. Mrs. Clement, ever the attentive hostess, had arranged for Clara Vane to join them for tea, a suggestion Miss Marple had made with the air of inviting a neighbor for a chat, but her purpose was far from social. Tom Rudge's confession had cast a shadow over the London buyer, and Miss Marple intended to probe the edges of her polished facade. Clara Vane arrived promptly, her gray wool coat draped over one arm, her auburn hair gleaming under the lamplight. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman accustomed to command, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightness around her mouth, a hint of strain beneath her city polish. Mrs. Clement bustled about, pouring tea and offering scones, her chatter filling the room with a veneer of normalcy. Inspector Craddock, invited at Miss Marple's insistence, sat near the window, his notebook discreetly tucked away, his presence a subtle reminder of the investigation's weight. "Thank you for coming, Miss Vane," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as the firelight. "It's so kind of you to indulge an old lady's curiosity about city ways. You must find our little village quite a change from London." Her smile was disarming, but her eyes were sharp, watching Clara's every gesture. Clara settled into a chair, her movements graceful but deliberate. "It's charming, Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth with practiced ease. "Quiet, of course, but that's its appeal. Greenbough Farm, especially such potential, if managed right." Her fingers brushed the edge of her teacup, and Miss Marple noted a faint smudge of scarlet lipstick, matching the stubs found in the orchard and near the gate. Craddock leaned forward, his tone polite but firm. "Miss Vane, we've had new information. Tom Rudge claims he saw you in the orchard near the shed, the night John Harrow died, around 9 o'clock. Care to explain?" Clara's smile didn't waver, but her eyes flickered, a brief shadow crossing her face. "Tom Rudge must be mistaken, Inspector. I was at the inn, as I told you, writing letters. Mr. Pym confirmed it. The orchard's dark at nighties, to see what isn't there." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of her grip on the teacup, a telltale sign of nerves. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "It's curious, isn't it, how shadows can play tricks? But Tom was quite certain. Gray coat, your hair, and there was a cigarette stub in the shed, with lipstick like yours. I knew a lady once, in my village, who left such a clue by mistake. It led to quite a revelation." Her tone was light, but her words were a needle, probing for a reaction. Clara's smile tightened, and she set her cup down with a faint clink. "I do smoke, Miss Marple, as I said, but I don't wander orchards at night, leaving stubs about. If Tom saw someone, it wasn't me. Perhaps someone else wears gray." Her voice held a trace of mockery, but her eyes darted to Craddock, as if gauging his response. Mrs. Clement, sensing the tension, chimed in, her voice bright. "Oh, gray's so common, isn't it? Why, Margaret Harrow has a gray shawl, and Ellen Gale, too. Though I suppose neither smokes," she faltered, glancing at Miss Marple, who gave her a reassuring nod. Craddock's voice cut through the chatter. "Miss Vane, you wanted Greenbough Farm badly. We've seen your letters persistent, to say the least. Why so keen? There are other orchards." Clara leaned back, her composure returning. "Business, Inspector. Greenbough cider is unmatched. But it's more than that. The farm's land borders a proposed railway line, did you know? A new route to London, planned for next year. That land's value will double, maybe triple, once the line's built. I saw an opportunity, and I pressed for it. John Harrow was stubborn, but I wasn't here to play games." Her tone was frank, but Miss Marple noted the calculation in her words, the way she offered just enough to seem open. Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly, a soft rhythm in the quiet room. "A railway line," she murmured. "How forward-thinking, Miss Vane. It would make the farm a gold mine, wouldn't it? Enough to tempt anyone, even to drastic measures." Her voice was gentle, but the implication hung in the air, and Clara's eyes narrowed. "If you're suggesting I killed Harrow for his land, you're mistaken," Clara said, her voice cool. "I don't need to resort to murder to close a deal. There are other farms, other opportunities." But her fingers brushed her coat, and Miss Marple noticed a missing button, the thread frayed where it had been. The button from the barn, she thought, its engraved design a match for Clara's sleek style. A small thing, but small things could unravel great lies. Craddock leaned forward, his voice steady. "Your alibi depends on Mr. Pym, Miss Vane, but innkeepers can be persuaded, can't they? A few pounds, A promise easy enough for a woman of your means. Clara's face hardened, but her smile remained. Mr. Pym's honest enough, Inspector. Ask the other guests I was in my room. And if Tom Rudge saw me, he's lying or confused. I had no reason to be in that shed, and no access to cyanide. Her tone was defiant, but Miss Marple caught the faint scent of her perfume, sharp and floral, matching the trace on the cigarette stub. A coincidence, perhaps, or a thread tying her to the crime. Mrs. Clement, eager to ease the tension, offered more tea, but Clara declined, rising with a graceful nod. I've answered your questions, Inspector. I'm staying at the inn until this is settled, but I've nothing more to say. Good evening. She swept out, her coat trailing, and Miss Marple noted the way her hand lingered on the doorframe, as if steadying herself. As the door closed, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his brow furrowed. She's hiding something, but she's too clever to crack easily. That railway line needs a motive, isn't it? More than just cider profits? Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the fire. Ambition is a powerful thing, Inspector. Clara. Vane sees opportunity where others see only apples. But clever people make mistakes, too, like leaving buttons or stubs behind. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a businessman's dropped pen had revealed his scheme. Clara's motive was clear, but the evidence was still a tangle of threads. The lipstick, the button, Tom's confession. Mrs. Clement, hovering nearby, spoke up, her voice hushed. Do you think it's her, Jane? She's so cold? Not like Margaret, with her tears, or Tom, with his temper. Miss Marple's smile was faint, but knowing. Coldness can hide heat, Lucy. Clara Vane wants us to see her as untouchable, but she's human, and humans falter. We must watch her closely, and the others, too. The truth is there, waiting to be seen. She picked up her knitting, the needles, resuming their rhythm, as her mind wove the day's clues into the pattern. Clara's ambition, the missing button, the innkeeper's loyalty. The tapestry was nearly complete, but one thread remained elusive, and Miss Marple would follow it, to its end.
Chapter 12. The truth unravelled. The kitchen of Greenbough Farm was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, its flagged floor scrubbed clean, but still bearing the faint echo of tragedy. Miss Jane Marple stood near the oak table, her shawl draped. Over her shoulders, her knitting bag tucked beneath a chair. The room was filled with a tense quiet, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Inspector Craddock had agreed to her request to gather the suspects Margaret Harrow, Tom Rudge, Henry Gale, and Clara Vane for a final reckoning, a method she favoured for its way of coaxing truth from the shadows. The village of St. Mary's. Hollow held its breath, the weight of John Harrow's death pressing on every heart, and Miss Marple, with her gentle demeanour and razor-sharp mind, was ready to weave the final threads of the mystery into a clear pattern. Margaret stood by the fireplace, her morning dress stark against her pale face, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles gleamed white. Tom Rudge leaned against the wall, his cap twisted in his hands, his eyes darting between the others with a mix of fear and defiance. Henry Gale sat heavily at the table, his florid face set in a scowl, his wife Ellen hovering behind him, her nervous hands smoothing her apron. Clara Vane, poised as ever in her grey wool coat, occupied a chair near the door, her expression cool but her fingers tapping a faint rhythm on her handbag. Craddock stood by the back door, his notebook closed, his presence a steady anchor as Miss Marple took the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice soft but carrying the weight of certainty, "John Harrow's death was no accident. A man does not die from his own cider, unless someone means him to. The cyanide in that jug," she gestured to the earthenware vessel, now in police custody, but vivid in memory, was placed there with intent by someone who knew his habits, his trust in that nightly drink. We are here to find that someone. Margaret's breath caught, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her eyes wide. Tom shifted, his boots scuffing the floor, while Henry snorted, his hands clenching. Clara's tapping paused, her gaze fixed on Miss Marple, with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Miss Marple's needles, though idle, seemed to click in her mind, counting out the clues as she spoke. "Let us begin with the obvious," she continued, her eyes sweeping the room. "Margaret, you prepared the cider, as you did every night. Your husband's death left you the farm, a heavy burden, but also a chance to escape its debts. You argued with him, didn't you, about Clara Vane's offers? The village heard your voices, raised in anger." Margaret flinched, her handkerchief crumpling, but she said nothing, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Miss Marple turned to Tom. "Mr. Rudge, you worked for Harrow for 10 years, enduring his temper and meagre wages. You were seen near the back gate that night, and you admitted to seeing someone in the orchard. Your resentment was no secret that it drove you to more than words." Tom's face reddened, his hands twisting the cap tighter, but he shook his head, his jaws set, and, "Mr. Gale," she said, her gaze settling on the burly farmer, "your feud with Harrow over the water ditch was the talk of the village. Your boots match the print in this kitchen, and your temper is legendary. Did you seek to end your rival's hold on the land?" Henry's scowl deepened, and Ellen gasped, her hand clutching his shoulder, but he only growled, "I'm no poisoner." Finally, Miss Marple's eyes met Clara's, steady and unyielding. "Miss Vane, you came from London with ambition, offering money for a farm whose value you knew would soar with the railway line. Your cigarette stubs, marked with scarlet lipstick, were found at the gate and in the shed. You were seen near that shed, where the cyanide was kept. A woman of your means could sway an innkeeper's word, couldn't she?" Clara's smile was thin, her fingers still, but her eyes held a flicker of something defiance, perhaps, or fear. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice as gentle as a breeze, but cutting through the tension. "Each of you had reason to wish John Harrow gone, but only one of you acted. The cyanide came from the shed, its lock broken long before the murder, known to those who worked this farm. The boot print, the cigarette stubs, the button in the barn, these are clues, but they are also distractions, meant to confuse us." She paused, her gaze settling on Clara. "Miss Vane, you are clever, but cleverness can be a trap. You knew the farm's value, not just for its cider, but for the railway. When Harrow refused your offers, you saw your plans slipping away. You visited the orchard that night, didn't you? You took the cyanide from the shed, where you'd seen it during your visits, and slipped into the kitchen when Margaret was upstairs. The jug was there, waiting, as you knew it would be." Clara's face hardened, her voice sharp. "That's nonsense, Miss Marple. I was at the inn, as Mr. Pym said. Tom's story is a lie, and those stubs could belong to anyone. You've no proof." But her hand clutched her handbag, and Miss Marple noted the missing button. Its absence a silent confession. Miss Marple's smile was faint, but knowing. "Proof is in the details, Miss Vane. The button from your coat, found in the barn, matches the one missing now. Your perfume clings to the cigarette stub in the shed, and Mr. Pym, when pressed, admitted you left the inn that night, after he thought you'd gone to bed. You knew the shed was unlocked. Perhaps you broke the lock yourself, days before, to ensure access, and Tom saw you, though he feared to speak until cornered. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tom's eyes widened, his cap falling to the floor. Henry leaned forward, his scowl replaced by surprise, while Ellen clutched his arm, her face pale. Clara's composure cracked, her eyes darting. To the door, but Craddock stepped forward, his presence a barrier. "Miss Vane," he said, his voice firm, "we found your fingerprints on the cyanide vial, faint but there. And a witness's stable boy at the inn saw your car near the farm. That night, will you come with us, or shall we continue?" Clara's shoulders sagged, her face a mask of cold resignation. "You're cleverer than you look, old woman," she said, her voice low. "Harrow was a fool, clinging to that land. I only meant to persuade him. The cyanide was a mistake, too much, too fast." Her words were a confession, brittle and final, and the room seemed to exhale. Craddock signalled to a constable waiting outside, and Clara was led away, her head high but her eyes empty. Margaret sank into a chair, her sobs breaking the silence, while Tom and Henry exchanged stunned glances. Ellen's hands trembled, but she said nothing. Her loyalty to her husband a quiet strength as the suspects dispersed. Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his expression a mix of admiration and disbelief. "You saw it all, didn't you? The button, the perfume, the lies. How did you know?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her eyes twinkling. "People are so predictable, Inspector. They think they can hide, but their habits betray them." Clara Vane wanted too much, and her ambition left a trail. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a thief's drop ticket had unravelled his scheme. The truth, she knew, was always in the small things. Later, at the vicarage, she sat with Mrs. Clement. Her knitting resumed, the needles clicking softly. "It's done, Lucy," she said, her voice gentle. "The village can rest now." Mrs. Clement shook her head, awed. "You're a marvel, Jane. How do you see what we miss?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes on the fire. "I only watch, Lucy, and listen. The truth tells its own story, if you let it." And with that, she returned to her knitting, the mystery solved until the next one called.